Okay, boxing fanatics, welcome to the 21st episode of the podcast. And today, we've got a bit more of a different kind of episode, I suppose. We want to discuss today about some comments Turkey made, um, well, a few weeks ago, really now, where he said he didn't want any more Tom and Jerry fights. So, for context, obviously, these comments came after, it's fair to say, a very disappointing week for boxing. It was a week where we had the New York card, which was, built to be this amazing event. It was, in the middle of, the middle of New York and all this kind of all this stage theatrics and stuff, and you had big fighters on the card like Devin Haney and Teofimo Lopez and Ryan Garcia. And let's be honest, it wasn't a great show. It was a real, it was a ball fest, really. It was really, really bad. And then this was followed by Canelo versus Skull, which might be possibly the worst undisputed fight we've seen in history, possibly in terms of a spectacle. It was that bad to watch. It was absolutely awful. Saying that, I remember clearly that in a way it did actually rescue that weekend. I remember with a sensational knockout. But that's where this all originated. But so it's been a few weeks now. Oscar, what was your first what was your first reaction when you heard Turkey saying that he doesn't want any more Tom and Jerry fights in boxing?
I don't know. I think from an outside perspective, where you're not a fighter yourself, you're not the one stepping in the ring. I don't think anyone, including myself, including Turkey, although he's obviously got the deepest pockets in boxing and he's paying all of these fighters purses. I still don't necessarily think that gives him the right to, kind of say, oh, well, the fights should be looking like this. You shouldn't be fighting these kind of styles. I think it ultimately comes down to matchmaking, to be fair. Obviously, you mentioned the weekend, and the two fights from those cards that stood out for me
Mhm,
were Canelo Skull and Devin Haney, Jose Ramirez. I
mhm,
think those two fights in particular are absolute stinkers.
mhm,
And ultimately, they were terrible matchups. I don't think, many people were really excited about those fights before they happened, especially the Canelo Skull one, where, they Skull somehow managed to fiddle his way to, winning the IBF belt. Even that fight was quite controversial. It could have easily swung to his opponent. And yeah, ultimately, it was just a way for Canelo to become a two-time undisputed champion or whatever he is. And I think, from Turki Al-Sheikh's perspective, he's creating these, big monster nights of boxing so that he can, accelerate tourism in Saudi Arabia effectively. Like it's all designed to kind of
mhm,
suit Saudi Arabia's political agendas. It's all geared towards sort of improving their image. It's a sports washing scheme, if you like. So, rightly or wrongly, that's what Riyadh's season is set up for. And obviously,
mhm,
boxing is a part of that. They're trying to use boxing or manipulate boxing in a certain way where it's going to, improve Saudi Arabia's economy one way or another. And
mhm,
you're not going to be able to do that, or it's not going to be as effective if the spectacles on the night aren't delivering. It's a lot of this is word of mouth. A lot of this is generating views, generating headlines, and nothing does that quite like a big night of boxing where people are really captivated, and it's a sort of big spectacle in that sense. And obviously, it's fair to say that Canelo's skull certainly wasn't that. And then you had Devin Haney, Jose Ramirez, where I don't know what everyone else was thinking before that fight, but I always thought it was a terrible matchup, considering Jose Ramirez, absolutely shot to pieces.
mhm,
I think we saw that in the Barboza fight that he had before. Couldn't cut the ring off. His legs clearly not what they used to be.
mhm,
Didn't have that same tenacity either, that we saw prior to the Josh Taylor fight. And then you have Devin Haney, who's obviously a slick operator. He knows how to, move around on the back foot, stick behind the jab, stick and move.
mhm,
And I did expect that kind of style of matchup where you've got Devin Haney effectively just boxing his head off. I knew that would happen.
mhm,
Perhaps I didn't think it would be to that extreme where, it was just an absolute snooze fest. But I knew all along that that was a terrible matchup. I don't think you have to be a boxing genius to sort of recognize that.
Mhm.
And clearly, Turki Al-Sheikh's strategy perhaps not going as he hoped it would have done, especially for that weekend. But at the same time, you've got to have a look at, the matchups that you're making. Like, I think, most people could have predicted that those two fights in particular weren't going to deliver fireworks, and they didn't. So I think if you're going to complain about Tom and Jerry matchups, don't make the Tom and Jerry matchups the ones that, look like they're going to be that way anyway.
That's a great point, to be fair. I didn't even think about that. That's a brilliant point. I mean, it's true. I mean, when Canelo's skull was announced, no one called for that fight, did they? No one was clamoring for that one. I think what made it even a little bit attractive was that, Canelo had a chance to become two-time undisputed champion, which he did. And it's true. Yeah, Devin Haney never really sets the world alight if we're being honest with his performances. But like you said, yeah, Ramirez, yeah, definitely had seen better days. So it's true when you look at it like that, it wasn't like a terrible, it wasn't a massive shock that um, they weren't great fights. It's true. But what I will say is that since these comments have been made, and as we've established, it's not the most exciting month for boxing, but there has been some fights, and I find it actually quite interesting how, following these comments, I think we've actually had some exciting fights. So I want to touch on first Richard Hitchens. So he knocked out George Kambosos last week, and Hitchens is someone who, kind of like Haney, is not known for being, particularly exciting. But whether it's coincidence or not, or maybe it's a testament to how maybe past it George Kambosos was, he produced probably one of the most aggressive performances of his career to get the knockout. Then you had Norman Jr., who, in fairness, is always an exciting fighter. You've previously said that he's got the X factor, but still, he produced a knockout of the year, which was lovely to see to brighten this month up a little bit. And then if we're talking about last night, we've got Galao Yafai, even though he lost against Rodriguez, it was another competitive, high action fight. So I guess what I'm getting at is, do you think the fighters have actually taken notice of these kind of comments by Turkey? Because, it's been a month, and I think it's fair to say that in the last month or so, it's been quite entertaining. I mean, we haven't seen maybe the elite at the division, the best pound for pound fighters or the best known fighters in the world fight, but still, if this month, despite being not having that many, attractive matchups, there has been some entertaining spectacles. So, is it possible the fighters have? Do you think they listen to what Turkey says and think, okay, he's saying there's no more Tom and Jerry anymore, so I need to actually be a bit more entertaining to keep my spot on these, high paying Riyadh cards?
Yeah, I think there could be an element of that. I think it's interesting you mention Richardson Hitchens because obviously he is known for, as you say, being a more Devin Haney's type fighter, sticking and moving, using his lateral movement. And he produced a really exciting performance against George Kambosos Jr. But what I would say is that was a bit of a match made in heaven for him. I think, it was designed for him to win in that kind of fashion. So, he obviously had the option of just kind of making it a 12 round bore fest, sticking behind the jab and sort of
Mhm.
boxing his head off. But yeah, he obviously boxed like he wanted to make a real statement that night. And that's obviously what he did. And he's made no secret that he wants those big sort of Riyadh season fights. He said in his post fight interview, he's a free agent now. And I
Mhm.
know that's got a lot of responses, but that was almost him sort of putting himself in the shop window, if you like, and being like, look, I've got the talent, I've got the ability, I can be exciting. Get me on some of these, high profile Riyadh season cards. So I think there might have been an element of that with Richardson Hitchens. I'm not sure about the other ones because, as you say, Brian Norman Jr. is typically, quite an exciting fighter.
Mhm.
His opponent wasn't up to much, Jin Sasaki. So
Mhm.
I was almost expecting that kind of statement from him, to be fair. And
Mhm.
then, yeah, obviously Galao Yafai, Francisco Rodriguez. Um, that was a high action, obviously high volume fight. Both fighters threw a lot of punches. I've got my sort of reservations about Rodriguez because I don't know if you saw, but his last fight was a no contest, and there's not been too much transparency about that. Even if you look online, There's nothing you can find in terms of why that was overturned to a no contest. And obviously, straight away, you're going to think, high volume puncher, breaking CompuBox records. Like, what's he doing behind the scenes? You can
Mm.
obviously connect the dots one way or another. Doesn't help that he's part of the Renoso camp either. But
Oh my goodness. That's the nail
but
in the that is.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But we'll have to see what happens with them. You suspect that there'd been a proper VADA testing for that fight. So we'll see if anything emerges. But yeah, I think maybe the fighters are listening to Turkey. Obviously, as I said at the start, he's got the deepest pockets. He's the one paying for fighters eye-watering sums of money. So
Mm.
they'd be not silly not to listen to him, but it'd be wise to kind of take on board what he's saying. And obviously, fighters, you know, I think it's an interesting one because in America, especially, I would say there's almost like a culture of sort of that's developed from the likes of Floyd Mayweather and Andre Ward, where it's like hit and not get hit, like that kind of culture, and the likes of Shakur Stevenson. Trying to think who else like I guess you could chuck. I was going to say John Ennis, but obviously he's a really exciting fight. But Shakur Stevenson, to just use him as an
Mm.
example, like
Yeah, yeah,
these sort of American, like slick American fighters who
yeah.
take a lot of inspiration from the likes of Floyd Mayweather and Andre Ward. I
Mm.
feel like there's almost this culture in American boxing where it's like hit and not get hit, put on a clinic and then like get your money and get out sort of thing. They're limiting the punches that they're going to be taking in the ring. And obviously, that's a clever thing to do. Like, boxing's a dangerous sport. So, no one's going to, fly out the traps with their chin up in the air and allow their
Mhm.
opponent to land, bombs on them. Um, at the same time, there's a bit of a pressure to entertain.
Mhm.
But, a lot of these sort of high level fighters who are able to put on a bit of a clinic, a bit of a, bit of a boxing lesson, they're kind of thinking to myself, right, let's limit the amount of damage that I'm taking in the ring. I'm not going to prioritize entertainment over my own safety.
Mhm. Mhm.
So I think, you're seeing that sort of culture in American boxing where a lot of fighters are sort of subscribing to that. And I don't know if that classifies them as a Tom and Jerry type fighter,
Mhm.
sort of box on the black back foot. But ultimately, from a hardcore fan's perspective, you can appreciate the kind of skill element to it and the work that goes into sort of cultivating that sort of style. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting conversation to be fair.
Mhm. Mhm. That's such a good point though about Floyd Mayweather. He definitely made it very cool to be defensively minded, I suppose, and to hit and not get hit. And I think as well to protect that O at all costs. That O is like it became like one of the biggest selling points. It was a reason why Mayweather made so much money. And obviously you look at his record and it's 50-0, and it's true. A lot of those fighters, and he's taken a lot of those fighters under his wing, hasn't he? He's spent time with Devin Haney. I think Hitchens was part of the Mayweather. He was signed to Mayweather, I believe, as well. So he's yeah, he's instilled this kind of mentality of hit and not get hit, and almost it's almost like get your viewership from I don't know if being dislikable is the word, but get your viewership, from your O rather than maybe your performances, rather than being kind of exciting. And yeah, like and I think Hitchens and Haney, I think they definitely had that mentality. It remains to be seen if they keep them, and Stevenson as well. I think they were definitely very inspired by Mayweather. And when you see what Mayweather accomplished, you can't really blame them as well because he's come out of the sport, very, very rich, and he's come out of the sport, with all his faculties intact as well. Another thing, another development is that Turkey, I heard, is thinking about offering bonuses for knockouts as well. So if we compare this to the UFC does have bonuses, I believe, for knockouts, for I think fight of the night, stuff like this. So I mean that's quite interesting because then you really are giving an incentive to, you know, to be entertaining because, if Turkey's giving you a big purse, I assume the bonus is going to be even bigger. So, I mean, is it possible that boxing's going to become, I guess, more like the UFC in a way? Maybe it's going to be a little bit I don't know how to phrase this in the right way. It's not about taking liberties, but maybe you're going to be forced maybe a little bit more to be entertaining. And if you want to really And it's not just about winning. Maybe it's going to become, is it fair to say that it's going to become more than just about winning? You need to win, but you also need to win in style, because even if you win, yeah, you might lose your spot. Like, so what do you think about, you know, yeah, boxing becoming like the UFC, I suppose, in that regards?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I saw obviously they're doing the Canelo Crawford media stuff this week, and I saw Dana White say that for performance of the night, they're offering upwards of six figures, like high sort of six figure sum for even just performance of the night. So they're not playing around. They're like yeah, they're really serious about these bonuses, it seems. I don't have anything against incentivizing knockouts, incentivizing highlight reel moments. Like if they want to do that, fair enough. From a fighter's perspective, I think it depends. Some of them will be eager to sort of claim those bonuses. Others, they're not going to want to take any silly risks just to entertain. I think there's a lot of really smart fighters out there who will think to themselves, well, I'd rather win the fight, to be honest.
Yeah.
I think I remember actually Eddie Hearn experimented with this quite a couple years ago. It was on one of his cards, and it was one of the like I think it was a 10 rounder, quite a low level one, maybe like an area title was on the line or English title. I'm not quite sure. And he offered a knockout bonus for that, and it ended up being like a 12 round snooze fest. So it doesn't always have the desired effect, is obviously what we
Oh,
saw in that example. But yeah, whether boxing will sort of become more like the UFC, obviously Dana White's, he's coming in, so maybe he's going to look to integrate some of the UFC type elements into boxing. Um, Obviously, it remains to be seen, just how far the sort of TKO Turkey involvement will go. But yeah, obviously with Dana White at the helm, you're going to expect some of these bonuses. You're going to expect some of the more outlandish press
mm,
conferences, I think, because obviously he's a big fan of freedom of speech. He likes fighters to express themselves, whether that's sort of done in a respectful way or not. But I think a lot of the UFC's promotion is geared towards these quite outlandish
mhm.
press conference moments. I know I'm not a big fan of the UFC, but I know you've got characters there like Colby Covington, who is like a Donald Trump supporter, and he sort of
Mhm.
gets a lot of people's backs up, plays that sort of pantomime villain type character, and maybe Dana White might even try and convince some fighters to sort of adopt that role, just in terms of elevating the promotion for some of these events. I mean, I saw just a minute ago, Canelo actually shoved Crawford on the stage at a press conference. And already fans are going to speculate and think that was sort of staged. If Dana White maybe gave him a bit of a whisper in the ear beforehand, was like, oh yeah, we could do with bumping up the ticket sales for this. Shove might look good on for the cameras, sort of thing. So you never know. You never know what sort of gets discussed behind the scenes. But yeah, obviously from a promotional perspective, there should be a lot of changes, and maybe even in the ring as well with some of these bonuses.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I didn't know about that, Canelo. I need to go watch that. I mean, that's quite out of character for Canelo to do that. To be honest, in Piers Morgan's interview, they were literally sat side by side, like buddies, I suppose. And you are right about the UFC. You do have also people like Paddy the Baddy and Conor McGregor and people like this who a bit who split opinion. As an understatement, probably. What about the repercussions though? Because I think this is probably the biggest argument against it. Boxing we know is not it's not a joke of a sport. I was reading Muhammad Ali's a biography by Muhammad Ali written, and it goes through his whole career, and it basically just says that, he took a lot of punches. He took a lot of punches, and it affected him later in life. And I think, I think we do need to remember that a little bit as well. These boxers, not they're not superhuman. If you take a lot of punches during your career, you're going to lose some years on your life, and in some cases, the remainder of your life is going to be of a lower quality. Obviously, Muhammad Ali, suffered from symptoms to do with Parkinson's. Um, and in the latter stages of his life, obviously, he had to be taken care of. So it's an interesting one because on one hand, this is a sport which is all about entertainment. Historically, it's been one of the most entertaining sports in the world. That's why it's one of the oldest sports. You know, the best, some of the best fights ever are basically wars in the ring, aren't they? They're fights where, both men are literally, fighting till their last drop. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier, the third one, Thriller Manila, it just sounds like that was an absolute war. So I guess, what do you think about that? I mean, I guess in the short term, this might ha lead to the sport becoming more entertaining. But in the long term, could we actually, I mean, is it possible we might even see more tragedies, so to speak? Fighters going to, having to go to hospital more after the fight, careers ending earlier. I never want to see any deaths, but that's obviously always a possibility in boxing as well. Um, what do you think about that? Could that happen?
Yeah, maybe. It depends on how seriously fighters take these Tom and Jerry comments. Obviously that money is a huge motivation and a huge factor for any fighter. So if they're quite eager to get these knockout bonuses and stuff, maybe they will even consider, reconstructing their style and adopting a more fan-friendly approach. Maybe like a more gung-ho approach where they're actually sort of going for it a little bit more. But to be honest with you, from my perspective, I've got absolutely no problem with a boxer wanting to, put on a bit of a clinic, hit and not get hit. Like I don't mind that. If they want to do that and they're getting away with it, then that's absolutely fine as far as I'm concerned. It's up to their opponent to try and disrupt that in some way, to try and disturb their rhythm and cut off the ring and stuff. If a boxer wants to win a fight by, boxing off the back foot, picking their shots, in a meticulous sort of way, then that's fine. If they can win fights doing that, then absolutely no problem. But yeah, I mean, in terms of like the approach from fighters, whether that's going to change with it, like Turkey's TKO involvement, it could potentially happen because you never know what is being discussed behind the scenes. Like if Turkey is paying these fighters extortionate amounts of money, then he could even be having conversations with some of these fighters behind closed doors and being like, look, I'm going to need you to start entertaining me. I'm going to need you to start putting on an absolute statement. I don't know if these conversations are happening, but as I say, you never know. But if he's sort of putting on this pressure on the social media with obviously saying the Tom and Jerry comments, and then maybe even if he sort of doubles down on that and just saying just putting on this sort of indirect pressure for fighters to
Mm,
entertain, then maybe you will start seeing more violent, I guess, more violent fights, where fighters are really leaving it all in the ring. I mean, a lot of them do that already, to be fair. Like that's just a fighter's mindset.
mhm.
Most fighters, that they're absolute warriors, aren't they? Like that they're going to be um, fighting with their heart on their sleeve, sort of, so to speak. But yeah, I mean, maybe with this pressure from Turkey, is obviously the paymaster in boxing at the minute. You might even see that to greater levels. Um,
Mhm.
Will that improve the sport? I don't know. Like it depends on you how you like to view boxing. Because for me, I don't mind a lot of these tactical chess matches. I know they're not the best from a casual perspective, but for me, I quite enjoy them. I quite like seeing the technical side of the sport and the
Mhm.
skill element that's on display. So, from my perspective, I think all of this outside pressure is unnecessary. Like, I think, if you're paying the fighters certain amounts of money to obviously get in the ring, and they're risking their lives, so they're doing enough for us. They're putting their lives on the line for our entertainment. You don't need to add any pressure to say, right, you got to entertain us. Well, if they're going to entertain, they're going to entertain. Like as I said, it's a promoter's job, and the likes of Turkey, it's their job to make the right matchups. And there's obviously an art to matchmaking. As I said, Canelo Skull's a great example of one that was never going to be a good fight in a million years. Whereas, Claudia fired Francisco Rodriguez. On paper, that was always going to be an entertaining fight. So yeah, it depends on a few things, and ultimately it boils down to how much the fighters kind of how seriously they take these types of comments, really.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. But I also think it depends on how serious Turkey is in terms of like if fighters start to get dropped and stuff like that. I know, like for example, Stevenson's had his kind of quarries with Turkey and stuff. So if, for example, like a big name starts to get left out of or frozen out because there's been plenty of fighters been frozen out over the years due to promotional issues. If fighters start to get frozen out because they're not entertaining, then that also could influence fighters to to go for it a little bit more and be a bit more aggressive because they know that if they don't produce a good performance, if they're not entertaining, then they're going to lose their spot. But I definitely get what you're saying. I think it's fair to say the average hardcore fan understands that it's a sport and that, being able to throw a jab, slip a shot is definitely commendable and it's enjoyable to watch. Whereas, let's be honest, most casual fans just want to see a fight. They want to see, they want to they want to see maybe a slightly more refined version of what they see on a Saturday night at the pub, but just in a ring, especially when they're in Wembley or wherever. I've had a few beers or whatever, they just want to have a good time. Well, look, Canelo versus Crawford is in a few months, so that's going to be the fight where we can actually. I mean, I think on paper you made a good point that depends on the matchmaking. I think matchmaking wise, I think that does have potential to be entertaining simply because I don't think Crawford is someone who necessarily um he's never ran really. He does hold his feet and he does throw. So I'd like to think that's going to be quite an entertaining fight. But thanks a lot, guys, for listening. As always, if you like this podcast, please like, comment, subscribe. And yeah, we'll catch you on the next one. Cheers.